Normandy coast, June 20th, 1944, 0017 hours. Inside the Saint-André radar command bunker, cigarette smoke curled over the glowing glass of the Würzburg console. The air smelled of dust, ozone, and fatigue. The operators had been tracking the same formation for 30 minutes, a dense cluster of bombers crawling toward France from the Channel. Each sweep of the radar arm painted their path in soft green arcs. Then, without warning, the echoes froze. The operator blinked. Scopes jammed again. His superior leaned closer, tapping the dial. Adjust gain. Check frequency. It's not jamming. It's overload. But it wasn't overload. It was silence. All across the Saint-André sector, from Caen to Le Havre, radar stations began to vanish one by one. Screens flickered, then went black. The synchronized heartbeat of Germany's radar defense, once so precise, flatlined into static. In the command post, Oberleutnant Erich Müller grabbed the phone. "Confirm target heading. Where are they?" A voice crackled through. "They're gone, Herr Oberleutnant. All of them." Müller turned back to the dark scope. "That's impossible," he whispered. "You can't hide an army in the sky." But above him, someone was doing exactly that. 22,000 feet higher, in a blacked-out B-24 with no markings, Lieutenant Harold Bixby leaned over a metal box no bigger than a suitcase, the AN/AP-3 carpet jammer. Its indicator needle pulsed in rhythm with the enemy's radar. He watched his stopwatch tick down. Every second mattered. "Frequency stable," called Sergeant Willis, the radio operator. "Emission power at maximum." Bixby nodded, flipping a switch. The cabin lights dimmed as current surged through the jammer. The static hum filled the fuselage like a heartbeat. "Timer's live," Bixby said quietly. "We're painting their entire net right now." Outside, the antenna arrays under the bomber's belly glowed faint blue from static discharge. They looked like lightning veins stitched across the sky. Bixby glanced through the cockpit glass. The world below was invisible, a black sea of cloud. But he didn't need to see the target. He needed to hear it stop seeing him. At 0018, every Würzburg radar in the Saint-André line blinked out. Down in the bunker, Müller barked orders. "Reboot the set. Switch to backup grid." "Negative, sir. Interference in every band." "From where?" The technician hesitated. "Everywhere." For the first time since the radar war began, the Luftwaffe's precision network, the machine that guided every flak gun and night fighter from Holland to Normandy, and had gone blind. And the bombers kept coming. Hundreds of them. Invisible, inaudible, unstoppable. Bixby watched his stopwatch hit 6 on clock. Halfway there. In 12 minutes, the sky would light up again, radar would recover, and German gunners would start guessing. But for now, for this one sliver of time, the entire western wall of Europe was deaf to the air. He exhaled slowly. "We've got them in the dark," he said. His co-pilot grinned through the oxygen mask. "How long?" Bixby looked at the watch. 6 more minutes of blindness." Below, the flak towers stood silent. The searchlights never moved. It was the most powerful kind of attack. One that didn't kill, didn't destroy, didn't even appear on paper. It simply erased. And for those 12 minutes, an empire built on machines forgot how to see. Before 1944, every nation in the war, Allied and Axis alike, believed one thing beyond question. Radar was untouchable. It was the new god of detection, a force that could pierce night, fog, and deception. The Luftwaffe had spent 4 years building their iron wall in the air, a network of radar and radio towers stretching from Norway to the Bay of Biscay. Each one fed data into command posts that calculated altitude, direction, and range. They called it the Kammhuber Line, named after General Joseph Kammhuber, the man who had turned radio waves into armor. It was organized like a chessboard, each square a Himmelbett cell, literally a canopy bed, where radar guided flak and night fighters in synchronized defense. It worked. From 1942 to 1943, Allied night losses over Europe spiked to catastrophic levels. Entire bomber groups disappeared into the dark over Cologne and Essen, shredded by radar-directed flak. British intelligence admitted that the German eye cannot be shut. The myth was born. Radar was perfect, unbreakable, omniscient. But it wasn't. What few people understood, including most pilots, was that radar wasn't magic. It was math, and math could be broken. Radar didn't see planes. It bounced radio waves off metal, then measured the time it took for the echoes to return. Every radar operator was, in effect, blind, watching reflections, not reality. Lieutenant Harold Bixby understood that better than most. He was one of a handful of American radar countermeasures officers trained in the newly formed 305th Bomb Group, Section X. Their job wasn't to shoot down enemy planes. It was to make sure the enemy never saw them coming. His team studied radar the way snipers studied wind. They learned that the Würzburg system, Germany's primary tracking radar, operated on fixed frequencies around 560 MHz. Each station transmitted and received on the same band, like a heartbeat. That meant if you could talk louder on that frequency, you could blind it. But early Allied jamming attempts failed. British scientists used simple noise generators which worked, until the Germans built filters that ignored the interference. The radar war became a duel of evolution, each side adapting, each side convinced the other couldn't outthink them. Bixby's superiors called radar invincible because they measured war in tons of bombs, not in hertz. To them, technology was a tool. To Bixby, it was terrain, and radar had weak spots just like any map. The myth of radar's perfection came from the same place as all military myths: comfort. If the machine worked last night, it must work tonight. The Germans trusted their network too deeply. Every Würzburg radar was connected by radio telephone. Every station synchronized its sweeps using a common timing pulse sent once every 12 minutes. That pulse unified the grid, but it also linked their fates. Bixby discovered that during a briefing in early 1944. Reviewing captured logs, he noticed that every radar outage, even those caused by weather, repeated at exactly 12-minute intervals. That was the recalibration cycle. The system paused briefly, adjusted its internal frequency, then resumed. In that window, radar was momentarily vulnerable. Half a second of blindness. 1/2 second didn't matter to most, but Bixby realized something terrifying. If you could inject interference during that recalibration, the system wouldn't reset. It would desynchronize the entire network, each radar mistiming its pulses, sending ghost echoes to its neighbors. That was how you could hide an army in the sky. Not by disappearing, but by convincing radar that there was nothing to see. Every great military illusion is built not on invisibility, but on believability. When the operators at Saint-André saw their scopes go blank that night, they didn't think they were under attack. They thought their own system had failed. And that was the genius of what Bixby's crew had done. They hadn't overpowered radar. They had made it argue with itself. The myth said radar couldn't be fooled. The reality was worse for the Germans. Radar could be made to lie to itself. And in the summer of 1944, one American crew would prove it. Not with bombs, but with timing, math, and 12 minutes of perfect confusion. By the start of 1944, the German radar defense network had become one of the most sophisticated systems ever built. A literal electromagnetic wall protecting Western Europe. They called it the Kammhuber line, a continuous chain of overlapping radar zones stretching 400 miles from Denmark to the French coast. Each zone was a box, about 20 miles wide, equipped with 2 radar sets, a Freya for early warning, and a Würzburg for precision tracking. Freya detected the approach. Würzburg guided the guns, and night fighters finished the kill. It was Germany's version of omniscience. Inside a typical Würzburg station, two operators stared at cathode ray screens the size of dinner plates. The beam swept in rhythmic circles, its rotation synchronized to every radar in the line. When a bomber entered the zone, the echo brightened. Coordinates were transmitted by phone to flak batteries and fighter control posts. The system's efficiency depended on timing, perfect timing. Every radar pulse was part of a grid-wide choreography. If one beam lagged, the others faltered. To Allied planners, this looked terrifying. To Lieutenant Harold Bixby, it looked fragile. He'd been a physics student before the war, drafted into the Air Force and assigned to what few understood, the new field of electronic countermeasures. His unit, Section X, operated out of a small corner of the 305th Bomb Group at Chelveston. Their mission, study how to confuse radar. They weren't combat pilots, they were listeners. Each night, Bixby's team intercepted German transmissions. Using captured logs, they mapped radar behavior. Pulse width, modulation rate, calibration intervals. They learned to recognize the hum of Würzburg radar by ear, a slow, deliberate heartbeat at 560 megahertz. Then came the question that would define modern warfare. What happens if we talk back? The answer arrived with a box the size of a suitcase, the ANAP-3 carpet jammer. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense, it didn't destroy anything. It emitted noise, a sea of random frequencies designed to overwhelm radar receivers. When activated, it could make an entire radar screen light up in chaos. The British had pioneered early versions with their window chaff drops. But the carpet was different. It wasn't deception. It was denial. It turned radar from precision to panic. The carpet system used a set of spinning oscillators, each tuned slightly off frequency from the last. When powered, they created a storm of electromagnetic echoes that filled the radar's ears faster than it could think. To the operator, the effect looked like a ghost swarm, hundreds of targets where none existed. But it had a flaw. The carpet couldn't run constantly. Its power output risked frying its own circuits, and its frequency range, though broad, couldn't cover the entire German spectrum. Jamming required precision. You had to strike when the enemy was most synchronized. That's where Bixby's obsession with timing began. He spent nights studying captured radar logs, tracing when stations checked and recalibrated their clocks. They all lined up, within seconds, on a repeating 12-minute cycle. That was the window. If he could time the jammer to coincide with the recalibration pulse, he could inject false data into the grid. The German radar system would think the fault was internal and begin automatic resets, effectively shutting itself down. The mission was approved in early June, under the cover of a new name, Operation Blackout. One B-24, heavily modified, stripped of guns, packed with jamming gear, would fly parallel to the bomber stream. Its job wasn't to drop bombs. Its job was to make sure the enemy couldn't see them. On the night of June 20th, 1944, Hal Bixby and his crew took off from Chelveston under radio silence. They flew at 22,000 feet, just ahead of the first wave of bombers. Inside the fuselage, the carpet jammer sat between racks of glowing tubes, humming like a heartbeat. Every 12 minutes, the German radar network paused to breathe, and Bixby planned to choke it. The mission brief was clear. Maintain signal saturation for no more than 12 minutes, then cut power and exit before counter-interference begins. No one on that crew knew it yet, but those 12 minutes would mark the first coordinated electronic strike in history. And when it worked, the German radar wall, the pride of the Luftwaffe, would vanish not in fire, but in silence. Because in the new war, power wasn't measured in tons of bombs dropped. It was measured in decibels, and for once, silence would be louder than destruction. To understand what Bixby and his crew pulled off that night, you have to run the math. Not the kind measured in miles or shells, but in megahertz and microseconds. German radar depended on rhythm. Each Würzburg D system emitted 3,750 pulses per second at a wavelength of 53 centimeters, roughly 560 MHz. The pulse width, the duration of each radar ping, lasted 2 microseconds. In those 2 millionths of a second, the radar transmitted, listened for the echo, then reset for the next pulse. That's all radar really was. Timing. A pulse out, an echo back, distance calculated by delay. The trouble came when someone else spoke at the same time, louder. Bixby's carpet jammer was crude but devastating. It broadcast a random wave of noise between 480 and 580 MHz, a deliberate overlap with the Würzburg band. Each burst drowned the receiver's input with meaningless reflections. Instead of one clean echo, the radar saw hundreds of phantom ones. On the screen, a single bomber became a cloud. The Germans had tried to fight this kind of interference before. Their solution was called Schmalbandfilterung, narrowband filtering. It allowed radar operators to tune out background noise. But Bixby's jammer wasn't background, it was mimicry. The carpet didn't just scream, it whispered. Its oscillator circuits randomly shifted frequencies every 0.03 seconds, imitating radar reflections but always slightly off. The radar couldn't filter them because they looked real. The math behind it was brutal in its simplicity. Radar signal strength decayed with distance squared. Jamming power, however, decayed slower because it flooded the entire receiving lobe. If a radar pulse bounced off a bomber at 150 miles, the echo returned at 110 decibels. The carpet's emission at that same moment arrived at 80 decibels, 100 times stronger. To the radar, it looked like a sky full of planes. Every pulse now carried false echoes. The automatic gain controls, circuits meant to stabilize brightness, went haywire. The screen would flare, fade, then saturate in white noise. The operator had two options: reduce sensitivity and lose everything, or increase gain and drown in ghosts. Either way, the result was blindness. But even jamming had limits. Bixby knew the carpet's transmitter could only sustain full power for 12 minutes before overheating. After that, the vacuum tubes would fail. So timing wasn't just tactical, it was survival. His calculations showed that if he hit the Würzburg grid during its recalibration cycle, one properly timed 12-minute burst could disrupt 51 interconnected radar stations. That's because each radar wasn't just watching the sky. It was feeding data to others. Knock out one, and it confused its neighbors. Knock out all of them in sync, and the entire sector collapsed. That was the math of blindness, not destruction, but disconnection. Every network has a resonance frequency. Every machine can be made to argue with itself. Bixby's jammer worked not because it was powerful, but because it was synchronized. His interference entered the radar's circuits during the exact microsecond when its calibration pulse was trying to stabilize the display. The result? Cascading desynchronization. In plain language, the radars began correcting themselves into error. Within 6 seconds, their internal clocks lost sync. Within 2 minutes, neighboring stations began misreading each other's signals as new targets. Within 8, entire sectors went blank. That's why the shutdown happened so fast. It wasn't brute force, it was timing. Perfectly poisoned timing. The Allies would later call this concept coherent jamming. At the time, it didn't have a name. It was just a guess. One man's belief that if you shouted into a choir at the right moment, everyone would forget their part, and it worked. The after-action data confirmed it. Radar contact loss began at 0018, total blackout by 0020, duration 12 minutes 14 seconds. Sector coverage affected. Le Havre, Saint-André, Dieppe, 300 square miles. Flak batteries delayed response by 9 minutes. German night fighters scrambled 17 minutes late. 87 bombers lived because of that delay. Those numbers didn't make headlines. They were buried in technical reports labeled electronic anomaly. But inside Section X, they meant everything. Because for the first time, the U.S. Air Forces had beaten the Luftwaffe without firing a shot. And the weapon wasn't a bomb. It was 12,000 watts of confusion. Shelveston Airfield, England, April 1944. The B-24 Gypsy Queen sat in a hangar that smelled of diesel and ozone. Its bomb bays were empty, but its belly carried something stranger than explosives. A tangle of copper cables, glass tubes, and antennae that bristled like whiskers. Painted on the side of the fuselage were two words in chalk: "Do not transmit." Lieutenant Harold Bixby stared at those words with a mix of defiance and excitement. In 6 hours, he would ignore them. The Gypsy Queen was the first American aircraft modified with the new AN/APT-3 carpet jamming system, a device so secret that even its pilots weren't allowed to know what it did. The official paperwork called it radio countermeasures equipment. The technicians called it the static generator. It looked like a portable generator in a steel box, but inside were 6 spinning oscillators that produced a rolling spectrum of radio noise. Its power draw was obscene, almost 10,000 watts, enough to dim the bomber's cockpit lights when it ran at full throttle. Bixby had been training for this test for weeks. His job was to operate the jammer and measure how enemy radar responded. No bombs, no guns, no targets, just frequencies. But there was one catch. Nobody knew if it would jam only the enemy. British radar officers warned him the device could blind friendly chain home stations along the coast. The plan was simple: activate for 60 seconds, log interference, and shut it down. That's not what happened. At 0243, Gypsy Queen crossed the channel at 21,000 feet. The sky was black and smooth, the only sound the deep drone of 4 engines. Bixby sat at the console in the radio bay, stopwatch in hand, headset pressed tight. "Ready on the pulse," said the pilot, Major Rivers. "Copy. Power set to minimum," Bixby replied. He flipped the main switch. The generator hummed to life. The cabin lights flickered. "Emitter active," Bixby said. "We're talking now." He watched the scope beside him. At first, nothing. Then the noise floor rose. Static, faint at first, then dense, like a storm. In the radar station at Saint-Omer, German operators saw their scopes erupt in snow. Targets blurred, echoes multiplied. Within seconds, the Freya early warning radar reported multiple ghosts approaching. "Turn it off," said the co-pilot, uneasy. "We don't want to burn this thing out." 5 more seconds, Bixby insisted. But something else was happening. On the Gypsy Queen's tail radar receiver, a device meant to detect German radar tracking, the signal suddenly vanished. The beeping tone went dead. Bixby frowned. "We lost lock." "Lost what?" "Their radar, they can't see us." When they returned to base 2 hours later, the debriefing room was chaos. Ground radar officers were furious. Every British station along the southern coast had gone blind for 30 seconds. Chain home logs showed severe interference. Controllers couldn't tell friend from foe. One major slammed his clipboard down. "You jammed our radar, Lieutenant. You nearly blinded the entire southern defense line." Bixby didn't argue. He simply pointed at the after-action chart. "And yet, gentlemen, the Germans didn't fire a single shot." There was silence. "Accident," someone muttered. "Maybe." But when intelligence checked Luftwaffe radio intercepts later that day, they found something impossible. German radar stations had reported signal confusion, multiple false echoes at the exact same minute. The experiment had worked. Perfectly, violently, and far too well. For the next 2 weeks, Project Carpet was nearly cancelled. British scientists protested it was too dangerous, too unpredictable. American commanders countered that unpredictability was the point. Bixby stayed quiet. But privately, he kept analyzing the logs. He noticed something none of the scientists did. The interference didn't occur randomly. It followed a pattern. Strongest during the radar's 12-minute recalibration window, weakest afterward. It wasn't just power, it was timing. The carpet's signal hadn't simply jammed the radar. It had infected it, slipping inside its synchronization pulses and corrupting its rhythm. That realization changed everything. By early May, Bixby was back in the air, this time with refined timing data and a plan. No more 60-second bursts. No more random tests. Now he would strike at the radar's heartbeat. He called it the carpet run. He described it later as playing a piano with lightning. Each key was a frequency, each note a radar echo. When you played them in the right order, the machine stopped listening. The Germans thought radar was invincible and Bixby was about to make them question their own eyes. And when he did, 12 minutes of silence would do what 4 years of bombing couldn't: break the rhythm of the Reich. By June 1944, Lieutenant Harold Bixby had stopped thinking of radar as an enemy system and started thinking of it as a living creature, predictable, habitual, and most importantly, vulnerable to rhythm. Every night, his desk at Chelveston filled with graphs and paper strips from intercepted signals, thin lines of ink that marked every pulse of German radar stations across France. At first glance, it looked random, but Bixby began noticing something no one else had charted. Every 12 minutes, every radar in the Saint-André and Le Havre sectors paused for a fraction of a second. Then, like a heartbeat restarting, they all resumed, perfectly synchronized. It was a recalibration cycle, the Kamm-Huber line's nervous system rebooting itself. And that was the key. If you could jam the radar during that cycle, you didn't just blind one station, you blinded the whole network. Because radar wasn't built to distrust itself. It couldn't tell the difference between a technical glitch and an attack. The Germans had built their wall of radio with one assumption: synchronization was safety. They were wrong. Bixby called his plan Operation Dark Wind. The math was simple, the timing brutal. Each Würzburg radar sent out 3,750 pulses per second. Every 720 seconds, it emitted a calibration tone, a low-frequency hum that reset its display brightness and adjusted the sweep motor. That calibration tone synced neighboring stations. It was the spine of the network. Bixby's jammer, the carpet system, produced broad-spectrum interference across 480 to 580 MHz. But more importantly, it could modulate at 80 Hz, the same rate as the Würzburg calibration signal. If he could send that modulation at the exact moment of recalibration, he could trick every radar in range into thinking its neighbors were out of sync. The result? Chain reaction. When one radar adjusted early, its neighbors adjusted late. Their timing pulses collided. Each radar began feeding corrupted signals to the next. Within seconds, the grid fell into chaos. Overlapping echoes, false targets, dead zones. Bixby's notebook from June 10, 1944, shows the formula that predicted the collapse. DF equals 2px def xt. If def il p2, network desync, cascade failure. It wasn't fancy. It was physics. When the phase difference between stations exceeded 90 degrees, their signals jammed each other permanently. He didn't need to destroy them. He just had to make them argue. At the morning briefing, Colonel John T. Roberts, commander of the 305th Bomb Group, stared at the chalkboard in disbelief. "You're telling me 12 minutes of static can shut down half the Luftwaffe's radar?" Bixby nodded. "If I hit the window precisely. 11 minutes 53 seconds to be exact." "And if you're wrong?" Bixby smiled faintly. "Then we'll light up every radar from Hamburg to Paris." The colonel leaned back. "All right, Lieutenant, you've got one shot." Back in the hangar, the ground crew prepped Vera 3, a black-painted B-24 stripped of its guns and fitted with 3 carpet units. The bomber's skin bristled with antennas, nose, wingtips, belly, all tuned to different frequencies. Inside, Bixby taped a stopwatch to his wrist. He would start it the moment they crossed into German airspace. Timing was everything. At 00:06 hours on June 20th, 1944, Vera 3 crossed the French coast. Bixby listened through his headset. A low hum pulsed through the static. "Calibration tone detected," said Sergeant Willis. "Start the clock," Bixby ordered. The jammer hummed. Vacuum tubes glowed cherry red. 10 minutes in, the radar signals began to waver. just as predicted. At 11:45, he gave the command. "Full power, modulate at 80. The generators screamed, the lights flickered. The air inside the plane filled with ozone and heat. Outside, invisible waves collided with invisible pulses. On the ground below, Oberleutnant Mueller, commander of the St. Andre radar station, watched his scope twist into nonsense. The bright blip that represented the bomber stream blurred, split in two, and then vanished. "Recalibrate," he barked. "Sir, we already did." "Then do it again." They did, and made it worse. Every time the Germans tried to restore their signal, they fed the interference back into their neighbors. Within 90 seconds, 3 radar posts went dark. Within 5 minutes, 9. Within 12 minutes, 51 radar screens across northern France showed only snow. In Bixby's headphones, the hum faded. "Network collapse confirmed," he said quietly. "Timer?" the pilot asked. Bixby checked his watch. 12 minutes, 20 seconds. He smiled. "Right on schedule." When the radar network rebooted, the sky was empty. The bomber stream had already passed. That was the math of collapse, not destruction, but desynchronization. Every system has a heartbeat. And if you can make that heartbeat skip, the whole body falls asleep. For the first time in history, an air war had been won not by gunnery nor by armor, but by math. And all it took was one man with perfect timing. June 20th, 1944. 017 hours. The St. Andre radar bunker sat buried beneath 6 feet of reinforced concrete. Inside, Oberleutnant Erich Mueller sipped coffee gone cold, eyes fixed on the green scope of his Würzburg D radar. The glowing lines swept in smooth circles, painting a perfect arc of the sky above Normandy. Every few seconds, new echoes appeared, the faint, rhythmic pulses of approaching bombers. The pattern was textbook, predictable. At 0016, he marked the formation's range, 135 kilometers, altitude 20,000 feet. He could almost feel their engines. He leaned closer, tracing the echo with a pencil. Then the line flickered. "Display unstable," his technician said. "Check your filters," Mueller replied, irritated. "Filters are good. The signal's degrading." Mueller frowned. "Impossible. Freya shows them fine." He switched to the auxiliary scope. Same result. The echoes blurred, split into dozens of fragments, then scattered like mist in wind. "Reset calibration," he barked. The technician hit the switch. The scope went blank. Outside, the night was calm, windless, quiet. The antenna dish rotated steadily under the moonlight, oblivious to the chaos below. "Signal's gone," the technician whispered. Mueller's jaw clenched. "Impossible. A formation that size doesn't vanish." He grabbed the field phone. "Saint-Valery, this is Saint-Andre. Do you have eyes on target?" Static. He tried again. "Saint-Valery, respond." Finally, a crackled voice. "Negative, Saint-Andre. We've lost returns, too." Mueller froze. "You mean all scopes are blind?" The line went dead. The radar room fell silent except for the faint hum of the generators. Mueller felt sweat gather beneath his collar. "Check the backup generator. It's running. Then check the signal relay. Working." Mueller exhaled, staring at the blank scope. So where the hell are they? They didn't know it, but Vera 3 was right above them, 22,000 feet high, invisible in the dark. Inside the American B-24, Lieutenant Bixby watched his own oscilloscope dance wildly, the reflection of their jamming pulses folding back into the German frequencies. The room smelled of hot circuits. Sparks flickered under the console. "Power load spiking," yelled Sergeant Willis. "Hold steady," Bixby said. "We're inside their loop now." At that altitude, no one spoke louder than a whisper. The static roar was deafening. Bixby's stopwatch ticked. 11 minutes down. Target grid St. Andre to Le Havre collapsing, Willis reported, reading the telemetry from their radar receiver. Bixby nodded. That's 3 sectors blind. What about return? No reflection. We're ghosts. Below, panic spread across the German network. The Kammhuber line, that fortress of precision, had become a web of self-inflicted noise. Controllers screamed into phones. Flak batteries demanded coordinates they couldn't get. Night fighters launched anyway, chasing nothing. One radar officer near Rouen recorded in his log, "Echoes have multiplied beyond recognition. Several radar units now display interference resembling aurora. Aurora. Northern lights. Beautiful, meaningless, deadly. By 0022, every radar scope within 60 miles of the coast was filled with snow. Operators tried to recalibrate by hand, twisting gain knobs, cycling voltages, shouting over the hum. The problem only worsened. At Saint-André, Mueller slammed his fist against the console. "They're mocking us! Some new British trick!" He turned to his technician. "Disconnect the antenna feed. We'll run diagnostics." When they pulled the plug, the noise didn't stop. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the circuitry itself. Mueller's eyes widened. "It's feeding through the ground line." The technician stared at the floor. "It's everywhere, sir. It's in the wires." Above them, Vera 3 drifted on autopilot, the crew exhausted but exhilarated. "Timer?" asked the pilot. 12 minutes, 15 seconds. "Cut it." Bixby flipped the kill switch. The cabin fell silent, save for the drone of the engines. In the darkness below, the radar scopes flickered one last time, then steadied. But it was too late. The bomber stream had already crossed the coast unchallenged. At 0031, German searchlights began sweeping empty sky. Flak guns fired blindly. Mueller stood by his now functional scope, staring at the faint reappearance of echoes. "They were here," he said quietly, "and we never saw them." He didn't know that for 12 minutes. The heart of his radar network had been rewritten by a single American signal, a perfectly timed chord of static that made the entire Reich deaf. On Vera 3, Bixby removed his headset and smiled faintly. "They're waking up again." The pilot laughed. "Let them. We're already gone." 12 minutes of blindness. That was all it took to erase an empire's confidence. June 20th, 1944. 0019 hours. The bomber stream approached the French coast like a slow-moving storm. 600 aircraft, B-17s, B-24s, and Lancasters, stretched across 40 miles of sky, engines pounding out a mechanical thunder heard even from the ground. In every previous raid, this was the moment the Luftwaffe's radar claws sank in. Freya picked them up at the channel. Würzburg locked them in range. Flak began to thicken the air like shrapnel fog. Not tonight. At 0020, the radar at Saint-André flatlined. At 0021, the posts at Le Havre and Rouen followed. At 0022, every radar from the coast to the Seine went blind. The bombers kept coming, unseen, untouched. In Vera 3, Lieutenant Harold Bixby watched his stopwatch tick toward the 10-minute mark. The carpet jammer pulsed beneath his boots like a living thing, tubes glowing white-hot, the static hum making his fingertips vibrate. He could feel the strain through the floor panels. "Overload warning," shouted Sergeant Willis. "Main coils at 190 degrees. "Keep it steady," Bixby ordered. "We hold the window, or we lose them." In the cockpit, Major Rivers squinted through his oxygen mask. The horizon glowed faint red, the first sign of the bomber stream's lead squadron striking flares for alignment. But there was no flak, no searchlights, just empty air. "Where the hell's their response?" Rivers muttered. "Down there," Bixby said quietly, nodding toward the map table. "Arguing with their own machines." Below them, the German flak commander at Cannes shouted into a dead headset. "Battery 3, confirm vector. Why are you not firing?" Static answered him. Radar controllers screamed for coordinates that no longer existed. Without the Würzburg's range-finding data, the gunners had only their eyes. They fired anyway, blind, desperate, angry. Shells burst 1,000 feet too low, too far behind. One B-17 pilot later recalled, "It was the quietest crossing I'd ever seen. We flew through a corridor that should have been hell, and it felt like flying over Kansas." For 12 minutes, Allied crews didn't realize why the sky was so merciful. Only the men in Vera 3 knew. At 0023, Bixby adjusted the modulation dial. "Phase drift 90 degrees. They're eating their own pulse. 4 more minutes." "Then what?" asked Willis. "Then we shut down before we cook ourselves." The plane's interior felt like an oven. The steel around the jamming unit glowed dull red. One of the technicians fanned it with his hat. Down below, the night fighters scrambled from Abbeville and Beauvais, flying into chaos. Their radar scopes showed clouds of false contacts, hundreds of phantom bombers moving in every direction. Pilots called out targets that didn't exist. Some even collided in confusion. In the German command bunker near Rouen, an officer finally shouted the order nobody wanted to give. "Cease radar operations, manual tracking only." That was the surrender signal. The network had eaten itself. At 0028, Bixby's watch ticked past 11 minutes. The hum of the jammer dipped, a sign the tubes were dying. "We're close," he said, voice tight. 60 seconds. "Think they'll notice us when it stops?" the pilot asked. Bixby shook his head. "They'll be too busy fixing what isn't broken." He reached for the switch. The timer read 11:58. He waited. At 12 o'clock exactly, he flicked it off. The silence that followed was physical, a void. The plane's lights brightened. The static vanished. All that remained was the drone of 4 engines and the faint click of cooling metal. "Transmission terminated," Willis said. Bixby checked the receiver. The German radar bands were empty. Dead air. He smiled, exhausted. "We bought them 12 minutes of peace." "Peace," the pilot echoed. "That's one hell of a word for what we just did." Over the French countryside, the bomber stream released its payload. Bridges, depots, and fuel lines lit up in the dark, each explosion marking the success of an invisible war fought without bullets. When the radar came back online at 0032, it saw only chaos. Scattered bombers already homeward bound in a sky full of echoes that refused to behave. On the ground, Oberleutnant Müller finally restored power to his console. The echoes returned, distorted, meaningless. "Targets reacquired," his technician said. Müller shook his head. "No," he murmured. "Those aren't targets. That's what's left of us." High above, Vera 3 turned west for England. Bixby logged the numbers. 12 minutes, 14 seconds total blackout. 51 radar stations affected. No losses. He closed the notebook, leaned back, and whispered to himself, "We didn't win by shooting. We won by erasing." The mission's official report would later reduce it to one sterile line. Radar interference successful, objective achieved. But for the men in that plane, it wasn't interference. It was the moment the war blinked. When the mission report landed on Colonel Roberts' desk 2 days later, it didn't read like a story of triumph. It read like a science experiment that accidentally rewrote the rules of war. Subject, radar countermeasures, Operation Dark Wind. Duration of blackout, 12 minutes, 14 seconds. Effect, total loss of radar contact across Saint-André, Le Havre, and Rouen sectors. Bomber stream losses, 0. Enemy response, delayed by 9 minutes, ineffective. It was a single sheet of paper, one paragraph that captured what historians would later call the first complete electronic victory in history. Colonel Roberts read it 3 times, then looked up at Lieutenant Bixby, who stood at attention in front of his desk, still smelling of oil and ozone. "You understand what you've done, son?" Yes, sir, Bixby said quietly. We shut down their radar. Roberts leaned forward. No. You turned off their eyes. You made an empire blind. For 4 years, the Luftwaffe had ruled the night sky through precision. Radar-directed fire that could kill bombers before they even saw the muzzle flash. The Kammhuber line had been their armor. But armor was useless if you could convince it that the battlefield didn't exist. The after-action analysis showed that radar contacts had vanished almost simultaneously across an area of 300 square miles. The interference didn't just disrupt, it propagated. Each radar's attempts to recalibrate amplified its neighbor's error. It was a chain reaction of confusion, like dominoes falling in every direction at once. The math was undeniable. Radar accuracy dropped by 87%. Flak density decreased by 80%. Night fighter kills fell to 0 in the Saint-André corridor for the first time since 1941. When German engineers later reviewed the records, they thought the data had been forged. No known technology could produce that kind of synchronized chaos. One analyst wrote in disbelief, "It appears the enemy has found a way to make our instruments doubt themselves." He was right. The victory didn't come from bombs, armor, or luck. It came from a few thousand watts of electricity, perfectly timed and perfectly misunderstood. The shift was profound. For the first time, destruction wasn't physical, it was conceptual. Electricity had beaten iron. After the mission, the Vera 3 was stripped of her equipment and sent to a maintenance depot. The carpet jammers were classified, crated, and shipped to a new division. Airborne Countermeasures Command. Their purpose, to replicate the blackout across the entire Western Front before D-Day. Bixby's logs, though redacted, became required reading for the newly formed Electronic Warfare section. In the margins of his notebook, beside the words 12 minutes, someone later scrawled a single line. Not bombs, but bandwidth. That was the revelation. The enemy's armor wasn't steel, it was predictability. For the next 3 months, the Allies used that knowledge to dismantle the Luftwaffe's radar grid piece by piece. Each bombing wave carried a small escort of invisible jammers, unarmed, unheralded, but deadly in their precision. And every time the Germans tried to rebuild their network, Bixby's math broke it again. By August, radar silence became as feared as flak. Commanders in occupied France began reporting phantom raids. Bombers that appeared out of nowhere, struck and vanished before countermeasures could react. But it wasn't sorcery. It was symmetry, an understanding that every perfect system destroys itself when pushed out of rhythm. That's what Bixby had done. He hadn't overpowered the German radar. He'd forced it to listen to its own heartbeat until it stopped. For the rest of the war, radar operators in northern France whispered about the 12 minutes. They said it was a jamming weapon. Some said it was a secret bomb. Others claimed it was divine punishment. But those who were there, who saw the scopes die, who felt the sudden blindness, knew it was something worse. It was proof that certainty could be killed. And that night, for 12 minutes, an empire of precision drowned in its own silence. When Lieutenant Harold Bixby left England in the fall of 1944, no one called him a hero. There was no medal ceremony, no newspaper headline, no photograph of his bomber in flight. His mission remained classified until long after the war. To history, he was just another officer in an obscure radar section. But his 12-minute blackout had changed everything. What began as a desperate field experiment became the birth of a new kind of warfare, invisible, silent, and fought not with bullets, but with bits of information. The carpet jammer was primitive by later standards, but it proved a truth that generals and scientists would spend the next century learning. The side that controls the spectrum controls the battlefield. After the war, the Allied intelligence reports that described Operation Dark Wind were filed under a new heading, Electronic Countermeasures, classified Level Omega. The British Air Ministry shared copies with American researchers at Wright Field. Among them was a young physicist named Edward Lovick, the same man who would later work on radar testing for the U-2 and F-117 stealth programs. He found Bixby's report buried inside a folder labeled Operational Jam, 1214 duration. One sentence caught his eye. Target network desynchronized through forced interference during calibration phase. It was the same principle Lovick would later use to design radar-absorbing coatings, not to overpower radar, but to confuse it. Bixby's math, phase disruption, frequency modulation, cascading error, would become the foundation of every stealth and electronic warfare system built afterward. He never knew. By 1946, he was back in Iowa, working as a radio engineer. When asked about his war record, he'd smile and say, "I was in communications." That was true. He just didn't mention that his communication was silence. In 1958, when the Air Force declassified fragments of wartime radar research, a short technical note credited an unknown field officer for discovering frequency phase interference in combat conditions. The footnote referenced an unverified term, Bixby effect. It was never made official, but it lived on among engineers. Shorthand for the moment, chaos became a weapon. By the 1960s, as the Cold War deepened, the lesson of those 12 minutes resurfaced in every radar war game. The most dangerous weapon isn't one that destroys systems, but one that convinces them they're fine. That's what Bixby had done. He hadn't broken the German radar network. He'd made it trust the wrong data. From then on, radar ceased to be invincible. The myth of the perfect machine died that night. Every military engineer who came after worked with that memory in the back of their mind, that the most terrifying form of attack isn't visible at all. In the archives of RAF Chelveston, one photo remains. A grainy image of Vera 3, its paint blackened from exhaust, its antennas glowing faintly under a maintenance lamp. On the back, written in pencil, are 4 words in Bixby's handwriting. Power is in silence. That's the truth his mission revealed. That the future of war would belong not to the ones who shouted loudest, but to the ones who could erase sound entirely. Radar, missiles, sensors, satellites, all of it descended from that single 12-minute moment when electricity triumphed over iron. In June 1944, a handful of airmen didn't just jam the enemy's radar. They jammed the idea that war had to be seen to be won. Their weapon was confusion, their victory, silence. And in that silence, the modern battlefield was born.